Emma, are we good? Can you see the right screen?
Yes, we're good.
Hi all, welcome. Hope you guys are enjoying the training. I'm going to be talking about vulnerability assessments. And so we're going to start off with a couple questions that we'd like you to respond in the chat box. And so if you have a moment, what do you think as vulnerable to climate change, and what do you feel like is already being impacted? Let's see what we've got. Nobody's put in anything yet. The coastline, Richard Day says, sea level rise. Paige says everything and everyone. Anybody else? Let's chime in.
I saw coffee and chocolate get put in there, and that's, I mean, not that I care about coffee, but chocolate, that's heartbreaking, yes.
Or wine.
Or wine, yeah.
All of the above. That's very sad.
But Anita put in ecosystems. Andrea put in aquatic ecosystems. So I know you guys, somebody talked about ecosystems already, right? So you guys talked about those types of things being impacted. Philip puts in bad soil makes the best wine.
Philip, you know that would make our presenter this morning upset when you're talking about the benefits of bad soil.
You got to find the positives in the negative.
This is very true, Philip. Very true.
All right. So I think that's, oh, Hakan put in water, living things. Those are all great answers, and we're going to dive into the topic a little more. So I'll go ahead. So at this point, you guys have got a lot of the climate science and the impacts of how climate is going to impact things. Vulnerability starts the discussion of talking about those key items of concern, and so moving into those consequences and the related actions and choices that we can take, and how do we get there. And so a lot of people ask, where do we start? And a vulnerability assessment is one of those key steps or things that we can do to start the climate adaptation planning process, and I'll get into that. So here's the climate adaptation planning cycle, as we refer to, and there's lots of versions of this. So there's water adaptation, there's ag adaptation, but basically they all have this sort of cycle. And so you define your planning purpose and your scope, and then you do your vulnerability assessment and determine your impacts. And we do that first to really figure out what's most vulnerable, and that drives your climate adaptation plan. So then you base your goals and objectives. You may revise them after you've determined your vulnerabilities, and then you look at your adaptation options for those based off of that vulnerability assessment, and it sort of determines where to focus your efforts. And Curtis is going to talk some more about the adaptation process and share some examples after me. So you'll get to hear more about that. So then you evaluate your actions or your options and determine which ones that you're going to implement. And then you implement and you work toward adapting. And then after a while, you determine and you monitor how well you're doing. And are you actually adapting and responding to climate change? Or is it not not strong enough, or your efforts not, maybe climate change is happening faster or more intense than we thought, and you have to go back to maybe some stronger adaptation options, or change your direction of what your plan is, of what you implement. And so this is a cycle, you know, as climate change happens in the future, you may need to revisit and revise your plan and update it. And so it's an ongoing process. So vulnerability really is about key items of concern. And I think you guys talked briefly about some of those, but whether you talked about them in a more comprehensive way of, you know, whether it's the cultural landscapes. I know we have Andrea from Chickasaw Nation, so that's very relevant of our cultural sites and other aspects of our culture. We've talked to you guys, many of you mentioned ecosystems. I don't think we had anybody talk about infrastructure vulnerabilities. That we have a lot of infrastructure, especially along the coast, that are vulnerable. And then species. There may be certain species that are more vulnerable than others. So it's really about, and so your vulnerability assessment is driven based off of what, you know, is your key items of concern and your goals and scope of your vulnerability assessment. So there are several definitions of vulnerability, and vulnerability assessments have been around for a long time. So the first one refers to more of the social science, so the human welfare that, and the political exposure to a range of harmful. So that definition, you know, is dated back in 1994. Has been around for a while. And then the vulnerability assessment field sort of moved into the exposure to contingencies and stress and difficulty in coping with them. One form of that is emergency management and risk assessments. And so they started getting at some of these ways of defining how do we cope with them and getting moving in that direction. But the third definition is the definition that we're going to use today. And it's from that report that you guys probably heard about, the IPCC report and their definition. And so vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. And so in the IPCC report, we specifically are looking at climate change vulnerability and vulnerability assessments. As I mentioned before, some of these other ones were other aspects of vulnerability that may not have been included for climate change. And so things like earthquakes or public health vulnerability, other things that this language sort of stemmed out of those fields. So when you think about a vulnerability assessment, so we've talked a lot about this red circle, you know, the climate stressors and hazards, or so temperature, precipitation, extreme events. Well, vulnerability assessments include a lot of other information and data. And so things like socioeconomic factors, enhanced environmental exposures, and then our ability to respond. So there's a lot of other types of information that you would need to do a vulnerability assessment. And the vulnerability assessment is really looking at all these things. And it falls right here in the middle. So we're going to talk about 3 key definitions that you would need to know about to think about a vulnerability assessment. The first one being exposure. So exposure is the degree of climate stress upon a particular unit of analysis. So things like long-term climate conditions, climate variability, the magnitude and frequency of extreme events. So exposure is really on the technical side of the climate data. The second definition is sensitivity. And sensitivity really is how big of an impact of the hazards. So for example, the precipitation variability in semi-arid areas, Oklahoma is exposed to drought. We have seen drought. We do see drought in Oklahoma. And sensitivity is really, you know, the degree to which a given community, again, you have to look at your local community or region or place, and the information that you would need to know about that area, and how that's being affected by climate. So in Oklahoma, we have crop damage, for example. So how big of an impact to crops, or how big of an impact to water resources in our region, or public health. So you look at sensitivity to specific types of things. And again, that would determine on what your goals and scope of your vulnerability assessment is, that you would have to determine what all you would want to look at and what's being impacted and what degree of impact. The third definition is adaptive capacity, and it's our capacity to cope or adapt. And so, or resilience coping is the ability to withstand the negative impacts from a hazard or a climate impact. So coping actions are things we do to protect ourselves from harm, whether it's getting help from friends or neighbors, or things like these things I list here, mutual aid agreements. Insurance is an adaptive practice. All these different things, or maybe it's education and capacity building, knowledge of developing the risk, and things like that. And so what is our capacity to adapt? When you look at vulnerability assessments, one of the key aspects of a vulnerability assessment are these matrices. And so they create scoring systems and different levels of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. In this example, we have 4 levels, both on sensitivity and adaptive capacity, with 0 being not affected and 4 being greatly affected. Or on the adaptive capacity, 0 is the system cannot adjust, that it's not going to be able to adapt. And then 4 being that we can adapt, that we are able to adjust and make efforts to adapt. And so if you look at a lot of vulnerability assessments, these sort of levels and number of levels sort of vary between different scales. So we're going to look at a couple of those. So this example that I pulled up is the Navajo vulnerability assessment, and they're looking at species. And so for the golden eagle, they have scored 3 of the categories as red, and so it is much more vulnerable than the mountain lion, where they didn't score any categories as red. So they looked at a number of different aspects and scored out. So here in this case, you know, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different categories that they scored, and reasons why these species could be vulnerable. And so this is just another example of those matrices and what you could look at. And so I'd also wanted to state that there are a lot of vulnerability assessments that have been done out there. So you may want to look at some of these others. If you're going to do a species vulnerability assessment, look and see if you agree with how vulnerable these things are in your area or region. And so if you have golden eagle, like we do here in Oklahoma, is it as vulnerable here in Oklahoma as it is out in Navajo region? And do you agree with the way they scored it? Things like that. Another aspect of vulnerability, as we talked about, is the adaptation. So the planning piece is a piece of the vulnerability assessment. So for oyster reefs, we know how to restore and farm oysters. We've been doing it for a long time. We know quite a bit about oysters and their habitat and how to restore. But there are a lot of things that we don't know that kind of information, and we don't know how to restore and what it would take to restore. And it's not something that people may not care about restoring at the scale that it would be needed and things like that. And so planning is often involved in your adaptive capacity. So we know how to restore oysters, so it's scored at a lower vulnerability. It's not considered as high of a vulnerability. And so and I wanted to mention, so this study that has been, a few of these, is the Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment. So those of you that are from the coast, Richard and others may be familiar with it. So they looked at species and they looked at habitats. So two different aspects. So the blue crab is green and is considered adaptable, where the marsh that the blue crab may live in is scored more vulnerable. And so looking at different aspects of a species versus the habitat that they live in. So before you sign up to do a vulnerability assessment, there's a lot of work or data that you may, like I mentioned, that you may need or information to be familiar or experts in a region or an area that you may want to talk with before. And so gathering that information to be able to do a vulnerability assessment is a heavy load sometimes. And so here's an example of some of the questions that you might want to develop and ask people. So this example, I use farmers. And so who has the data for farmers in our jurisdiction? What do they grow and raise? Are the farmers able to adapt to more intense and recurring droughts? Or why are they not able to adapt? Is it economic? How bad is the economic impact of a drought? So maybe looking at some of the historic droughts and economic data there. What would be needed to adapt over time? So, are they needing irrigation equipment or new equipment to grow a different kind of crop, or the capacity, the knowledge to grow a different crop? Help these species that aren't doing as well and growing them in new regions of the U.S. Does your organization assist farmers, and who does that type of thing to respond? And especially when droughts hit, does your organization step up and do any response and things like that? So a lot of information, again, that goes into the vulnerability assessment. And so to think about before you start that road. So again, just to bring back the climate adaptation planning cycle. So ideally the first step is the vulnerability assessment to work toward the adaptation planning. And we'll talk more about that. And so I wanted to share some resources, guidebooks and frameworks and things like that that you may want to look at if you're considering doing a vulnerability assessment or a climate adaptation plan. And so there's this document called the Scanning for the Conservation Horizon. It really is for your species vulnerability assessment. We've done some of those trainings here in our region. Actually, Chickasaw Nation hosted two of them, one at Drought and one at Pueblo, Oaxaca in New Mexico. And so we've got the online materials on our website. And we'd be happy to share those with you if you're interested in that. Another tool is what we call the NatureServe Climate Change Vulnerability Index. So again, a lot of this work may have already been done for some of the things that you may be interested in. So this specific index looks at three primary components of vulnerability. So they're looking at species exposure, sensitivity, and capacity again. And they have 5 categories. So again, those matrices. So they have 5 different scores. One of the though, you guys learned a lot about climate data that we have and the best available science in our region. Unfortunately, this tool uses climate data from the Climate Wizard, which is not recommended by the CASC. But I still highly recommend it because there's a lot of information out there and on vulnerability already been done. So here's their link if you're interested. And so they have their tool and their training available on their website. Another tool is what they call SAVS, or System for Assessing Vulnerability of Species. And this is a different approach. So this is basically a questionnaire type approach where you would have to find experts and information put into the questionnaire to determine how vulnerable the species. So this isn't determinant on what kind of climate data you have available. You can use whatever kind of climate data you want. So you could use our data for this. So you would have to gather the published materials and the experts and all that to figure out to answer all the questions. And it creates a much broader scale of scores. So you have an overall score that scales from -20 to a +20. And so you get a much broader look at where these things fall and how vulnerable things are. And so I provide the link for that. And so you can check that out. They have some great tools there too. Another approach is what we call the climate smart framework. And again, you have water climate smart, ag climate smart. It's popping up in a lot of different sectors and versions of this, but this is the main one. And so basically this is a tool to help you integrate climate into your existing plans. And so if you're doing a water plan or a forestry plan or an emergency management plan, this is a great tool that gives you sort of aspects of how to include climate in a smart way and goals and helps you. And so another aspect is the monitoring plan. So if you do monitoring, you can include climate into your monitoring plan, and there's a chapter on that as well. And so this is one of my favorite and most recommended resources that I refer people to. So Chris is going to talk about this one some more, and I just provided some links, but I will let Chris talk more about it here in a few minutes about what he does. I wanted to share the EPA Create Tool, which is a water utilities adaptation tool, and they have several aspects of it. They just created their vulnerability self-assessment tool, which helps your water utilities look at their vulnerabilities. And this helps with the requirement that's in the American Water Infrastructure Act. The one thing with this, I will say that it is very broad. It's created at the national level, and it includes anything and everything water adaptation that you could think of and options. And so it's really hard to get it down to a narrow focus, especially at a rural, small water utility level to use it. But it's a great tool and resource as well. EPA also has their drought response and recovery guide for water utilities. And so that's another resource as well. And then the National Park Service has their climate strategy. And so I share that with you here. As another resource. And I just wanted to share with you all that the National Park Service has a working group that I'm a part of. And we are looking at climate impacts to cultural resources. And so National Park Service is hiring 2 cultural resource staff currently. And so one aspect of what we're working on is a vulnerability assessment framework or resource for cultural heritage. And it's supposed to be coming out, was supposed to come out this spring, but it hasn't come out yet. And then we're also looking, so they've been doing vulnerability assessments for some of the national parks. And so they are developing a report as well, where they've been doing these vulnerability assessments already. And so we've been partnering with them on that. And so some of the impacts that, you know, cultural sites may be things like this example where the wall is collapsed due to extreme precipitation in monsoons. And then thinking about some adaptation options for cultural resources. So whether you don't do anything or you want to offset the stresses or improve the resilience, or if you want to actively manage the change, or if in this case with the lighthouse here that they are relocated it to a higher ground. And so that's all I have for you guys today to share with you about and introduce some of the terms. As I mentioned, Chris is going to talk more into adaptation options and share some examples here in a few minutes.